So you can see here in Huntington Beach is the area I grew up in, and basically I had an idyllic bringing up. Also in Garden Grove, where I spent most of my years. Initially, I was born in Pacific Palisades, Santa Monica area at St. John's Hospital. To tell you just a little bit about my family, I never really knew my father till I was 27, as my mom and he separated. He left the country for tax evasion, and he was a very brilliant man. And when I lived in Pacific Palisades, which is probably the most important neighborhood in terms of value, or at least one of the top 5 in the world, because it didn't lose its value. Not that I knew this wealth anything other than as a 1-year-old. I did not grow up in that type of opulence. But my father at one time had, in the late 50s, in that floor safe of his, a $1 million cash. That's a true story. I went back there and took my mom to see the old house one time, and it was owned actually by one of the Star Trek incidental people that was on the Trouble with Tribbles episode. I think he's passed away now, and he was the bartender on that episode. So that's what happened to the house later on. But so my mother and father separated as he left for Europe to evade arrest, and Europe and South America and many other places. And then then we moved in with my aunt in Laguna Beach, and moved into a house then into Garden Grove, which is really the house I grew up in Garden Grove. And then later on moved to other cities, Irvine, Huntington Beach, etc., as I was an adult. But I had a mother who was I say the Lincoln statement, everything I am or ever hope to be is because of my mother. And I honestly and truly believe that. She was the greatest human being I ever met, and I studied with the biggest artists in the world, and I got the greatest human being I ever met was my mother, and I mean that sincerely. She was a private investigator in the 60s. I used to call her Honey West. She was one of 13 women who had her own private investigation license. So I grew up in an interesting household with her and my grandmother who took care of me, her mother. And she was, when I say she was a private investigator, I'm going to tell you a few stories about her to show you it was truly James Bond scenarios. She was investigating one time. At that time, police would hire the private investigators because they could do things outside the purview of law enforcement officers, FBI, local law enforcement, that. So they'd hire him as an adjunct to do certain things. And she was, what should we say, a spy in a chemical plant, because they thought that the formula for the outer coating of the Titan missile, which was being manufactured there, was being stolen by foreign agents. So she was there as a plant, so to speak, in the plant. And what happened? I go, well, my mother was incredibly beautiful, and I always laughed at this story because I said, Mom, do you really believe that somebody's going to believe you're a worker girl on this factory line? And because she was so stunning. And so they found out, meaning the people that were trying to steal this formula, that they were onto her. And so she and her partner used to call her Sam, out of Sam Spade, the detective Dashiell Hammett novel. And they were in the plant one weekend, and these people find out my mother was a spy, and they handcuffed her, tied her up, and they were literally going to hanging her by her arms and lowering her into a vat of plastic to kill her and dissolve her body. It is a true story. I mean, it sounds like it's an Ian Fleming novel, but it's true. And so her partner came in very, he said, well, I haven't heard from her, I'm getting worried about her. So he was in the car listening. They had a bug, a transmitter. But in those days, they were very weak, meaning they weren't, any power and couldn't go through brick walls or cement walls. And so they came back, and he held the gun on him and said, release her. And so that's one of my mother's harrowing stories, and many, many more of those. So I had an interesting background. That was one of her professions. She was also in the personnel field and many other things.
Cool.